And I am delighted and honored to be here, be with you virtually. I hope you have had a great conference so far. I would like to thank the North Dakota Library Association for inviting me to speak. And thanks also to Aaron Stefanich for making all the arrangements. Today I'm going to be talking to you about two of my titles. My most recent book, The One Thing You'd Save, which is a collection of linked poems, and also my historical fiction middle grade novel, Prairie Lotus. And I'm going to start with The One Thing You'd Save and hopefully screen share. I'm hoping that someone can let me know if the screen share is working. Okay, great. The premise of The One Thing You'd Save is a simple one. Most of you are probably familiar with the standard parlor game question, which a classroom teacher asks of her students. She asks them to imagine that their home is on fire and that all people and pets are safe. So what is the one thing they would want to save? So I am going to read now a few poems from the beginning of the book. Imagine that your home is on fire. You're allowed to save one thing. Your family and pets are safe, so don't worry about them. Your most important thing, any size. A grand piano? Fine. So that was Miss Chang, the teacher. And here we start off with one of her students. For once, we got good homework, not useless stuff like worksheets. Best part is, Miss Chang says, we don't have to write anything down. Just think about it so we can discuss it with everyone. We're supposed to pretend there's a fire and we can say just one thing. Miss Chang says, size and weight don't matter, could be anything. And don't worry about family or pets. They're already safe. Phew. Makes things harder though, because I would have saved my Nana first. Arthritis, it hurts her to walk. If I tried to get her out, I'd have to hurry her up and tell her she doesn't need her good hat. I wonder what May's taking. Maybe I'll give her a call. Hey, that's it, my phone. I'll need it to tell all my friends. And besides, somebody's got to call 911, right? All right, another student. One thing? That's impossible. How can I ever pick just one thing? I've got so much stuff I'd want to take. My books for a start, my graphic novels and my manga, my Calvin and Hobbes. Heck, my Neil deGrasse Tyson books, 7 all by themselves. I couldn't pick a favorite. Every one of them is awesome. Oh man, I hate this. I'm never going to be able to decide. Okay, oops, sorry. So Ms. Chang's students ponder, respond, discuss, and sometimes change their minds. The items they want to save vary widely, from the sensible and utilitarian to the deeply sentimental and personal. The idea for this book came directly from my writing process. When I'm creating a character, of course, I think a lot about what they look like and their personalities, how they talk, but I also think a lot about their stuff. One mental exercise I do is to imagine their bedrooms or their other personal spaces. In my mind, I walk in there when they're not there and I poke around. Is their bed neatly made or all rumpled? Do they even have a bed? What's on their shelves, their desk, their nightstands? What items are prominently displayed? What others are shoved in the back of the closet, out of sight maybe, but not thrown away? Here in the US and other parts of the world, most of us have a lot of stuff. That is not true of all peoples or all cultures. What does our stuff say about us as individuals, as a culture in general? I wondered for years if it would be possible to write an entire book that was just about stuff, about things. Because you can tell a lot about a person by their stuff, by the things that they value. Well, writing a book about just stuff turned out to be one of those ideas that got filed under really bad. Of course, I couldn't write a book without any characters in it. Even if it was a toaster, it would have to be a brave little toaster, right? But that's when the if there was a fire question occurred to me, that would be a way of getting at people via their stuff. The line format of the book is borrowed from shijo, which is a Korean verse form. You can see that the lines are laid out in groups of 3. In 2007, I published a collection of poems called Tap Dancing on the Roof, and that is a collection of shijo poems. Ever since then, I wanted to return to the form. A lot of Americans know about haiku, about the Japanese verse form that's 3 lines long, very, very short lines. A lot of students get a haiku unit at some point in their elementary education and so forth. Shijo is also a 3-line form, but as you can see, the lines are much longer than a haiku. And it's also a really wonderful form. And as I said, a lot of people know about haiku and almost nobody knows about shijo. And I was like, well, why is that? That's not fair. So I decided that I would write a collection of shijo for young readers in the hope of introducing them to that form. Because shijo uses beats and syllables, and rhyming is completely optional, I found the form a natural fit for both dialogue and interior monologue. And this gives the book sort of a best of both worlds aspect. Many readers don't even notice that it's written in a poetic form, and that's fine, especially for those who think that they don't like poetry. At the same time, readers who love poetry might like to learn a little bit more about shijo. And there is a website at the top here with shijo resources. You are welcome to take screenshots of any of these slides that I am showing you. So this has great resources, exercises, and assistance for people who would like, for teachers who would like to, and educators who would like to introduce shijo to their students. Okay, my initial idea had been a simple collection of poems. One kid, one thing, one poem. And that's how I started out. But this is a great example of how the writing process itself can inform a story. As I wrote the poems, the kids came to life for me, and exactly like kids in real life, they would not stay where I put them. They didn't want to sit nicely inside their individual poems. They wanted to get up and walk around and talk to one another. So the setting became a classroom in which the teacher asks that question for discussion, and the students respond. The book is unconventional in several ways. It's for middle grade and middle school students, but it's only 70 pages long. It's fully illustrated, but it's not a graphic novel or a picture book. There are threads that run through the book, but it's not a standard narrative. It's also an unconventional read because there are no dialogue tags. In other words, the speaker of each poem is not identified. For Ms. Chang, the teacher, her poems are set in a different font, but none of the other characters are set apart in that way. There are no tags where it says Chris said, or said the teacher, right? And a lot of readers find that difficult. I get a lot of comments that I needed to hear who's talking. I couldn't understand who was, whose poem was whose. But I made that choice for a couple of reasons. First, it gives the book a little bit of a puzzle aspect. I love puzzles and word games. So those who read the book carefully will be able to figure out who some of the speakers are because other characters refer to them by name. I wonder if I have that. I can't remember. Hang on a second. But if I take books, I'll have to leave my game cards behind. Know how long it took me to collect them? And the Crimson Phoenix I only just traded for. I haven't even played with it yet. Oh no, don't you go there, Jay. We stopped with those cards ages ago. Yeah, Jay, give up that baby stuff. That's enough. Class, we protect, affect, respect one another. Thank you. Who's next? So from those two poems, you learn that the person who's debating about taking his game cards is named Jay, right? Also, the teacher's chant, we protect, affect, respect one another. I have had the privilege of visiting hundreds and hundreds of classrooms in my career over the many years, and I have always been delighted when teachers use a chant to get their students' attention and to sort of create a sense of community. So I've always remembered one of my favorites, a teacher in the Bronx who said to his students, "Are we clear here?" I said, "Are we clear here?" And the answer altogether was, "Crystal." So I wanted to put one of those chants in my book for this teacher. So once again, you can see from these two poems, there are no dialogue tags. And besides the puzzle aspect, I'm hoping that this book will encourage attentive reading. So much of what we're all exposed to these days goes by so fast, right? I worry that our skills for deeper thinking, for reflection, for digging below the surface may be eroding. By not including dialogue tags, I'm asking readers to take a little more time with these little poems, very little type on the page, right? Print on the page. Take a little more time and think a little bit more deeply about what they read. Well, I had hoped this book would find a home in libraries and classrooms, and that educators would be able to use it for discussion, as a poetry activity, a writing prompt, even maybe a springboard to talk about the environment and climate crisis. How much stuff do we really need? But since the book was published in March, I've been humbled and gratified by the response that I've received from educators. The comment repeated most often is that the book has led to discussions with their students that resulted in teachers getting to know them better, way better than they have with any other kind of sharing activity. Somehow, students feel safer, some of them, talking about a thing rather than being asked to talk about themselves, right? If you see what I mean. And several teachers have told me that they will be using this every year to introduce as an icebreaker very early in the school year to get to know themselves and their students. It is, once again, it seems to be a safe way for students to share stories about themselves and their own lives. And that's the heart of what I want to get at in this talk, the importance of sharing stories. Okay, so of course, I've also had to think very hard about the one thing I would save, because I get asked that question a lot when I talk about this book. I'm kind of like Jay in the book itself. I have a hard time making up my mind. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about my parents, who are very elderly. My father retired from his work in computer programming and has become a very accomplished painter. He does Chinese brushwork and Chinese calligraphy and Asian brush painting, and his work is very beautiful. So I have a few paintings of his. And of course, as he's getting older, he's 87 now, he's not painting as much. And so I sometimes think that that's what I would grab. I would grab a couple of my dad's paintings as I ran out the door. Oh, by the way, Ms. Cheng also says very clearly in the book, if this were real life, you don't grab anything, you just get out without stopping, right? So she does say that in the book. I do change my mind, as some of the students do. I change my mind about what I would grab. And usually what I answer is that I would grab this little wooden box which has in it a round medal. And that is the 2002 Newbery Medal for a single shard, which is, of course, incredibly precious to me. And the reason that I think that maybe I should grab this is because I do not know if ALA would give me another one if I lost it. If it got lost in any way, I'm not sure I could ask them for another one. So that's often the answer I give about what I would grab, if what would be the one thing I would save. All right, when I began preparing this talk, my editor at Clarion Books, Ann Hoppy, pointed out something that surprised me. Prairie Lotus is set in 1880, and the main character is a 14-year-old girl named Hannah, who moves with her father from California to Oceti-Sakowee homeland, what the US government called Dakota Territory at the time. There is a flashback in the book to a fire that happened when Hannah was 5 years old. It's not just a home that burns, it's an entire community. And there's an object very important to Hannah that survives that fire. Well, I don't know about you, but I've known for a long time that my subconscious is much smarter than my conscious. And clearly my subconscious created that link between the two books and also provided me with a very nice segue. The fire in Prairie Lotus is part of a historical event, the 1871 Chinese massacre in Los Angeles. More than 15 Chinese men were lynched by a white mob, and the resulting riot burned down most of the Chinatown neighborhood. I learned about the massacre when I was an adult. I had never heard about it before, never read about it, was never taught it in school. I wrote Prairie Lotus in an attempt to dismantle one of the many single stories in the American consciousness, and indeed internationally as well. The single story is a concept that received wide attention because of a TED Talk by the novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in 2009. Adichie titled her talk, "The Danger of a Single Story." I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, and if you haven't already heard it, I highly recommend that you go online to listen to it. The single story is a sophisticated concept. It's the idea that there are certain stories accepted as truth by almost everyone that are pervasive through our culture and society. These single stories are dangerous because at their narrowest and most singular, they're actually untrue. They're lies. It took me a while to figure out how to talk about the single story to young readers, but as happens so often, I shouldn't have worried because they had no trouble understanding the concept. When I talk about the single story to kids, I do a couple of different things. Here's what I say first. Did you ever have an argument with another kid, maybe your brother or sister or sibling, someone in school, and it was a serious enough argument that an adult had to step in to intervene? Imagine a situation like that, or recall when it's happened to you. Now imagine that the other kid gets to tell their side of the story first. So they tell the adult what happened from their point of view. And then the adult makes a decision about punishment or consequences without hearing your side of the story. Maybe the other kid doesn't even lie about what happened, but they tell the story from their perspective and yours gets left out. Not fair, right? The other person's side of the story is only part of the truth. It's not the whole truth. That is an example of the single story on a personal level. Now here is another example. I want you all to take a moment and picture a cowboy. Mental image of a cowboy in your head. You got that? Okay. Now make it a group of cowboys. 10 cowboys, 20 cowboys, a few dozen cowboys hanging out together some on horses, some standing around by a corral. Okay, so you're picturing a group of cowboys. Did any of your cowboys in your head look like this? These are photos of Black cowboys from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries. For about 100 years during the heyday of the cowboy, 1 in 4 cowboys was Black. 1 in 4. Not 1 in 10 or 1 in 100, 1 in 4. That group of 30 or 40 cowboys that you pictured, if it was historically accurate, should have included about 10 Black cowboys. But I'm going to bet that most of us, including myself when I first did this, pictured groups of cowboys who were all or almost all white. And that is the single story of the cowboy that most of us have accepted because we've been told it so many times through books, media, Hollywood movies, all kinds of popular culture. That single story erases Black and Latin and cowboys of other ethnicities who made important contributions to cowboy culture and to our US history. So that's how I present the concept of the single story to kids. That same kind of single story exists when we think about what we call pioneers. The people who left their homes, moved hundreds of miles to make new homes in the American West and Midwest. That single story includes covered wagons and log cabins and brave, adventurous, daring people. White people. But it wasn't just white people on the continent at the time. Between our education system, the historical record, and popular culture, that is the single story that has been drilled into all of us so deeply that it's become part of our national DNA. In Prairie Lotus, Hannah wants to graduate from high school and become a seamstress in her father's shop. Those might seem reasonable enough goals for a teenage girl, but because she is half Asian, she faces obstacles that no one should have to face, let alone a 14-year-old girl. Bullying, ostracization, hatred, even physical assault. There is a long and shameful history of racism against Asians here in the United States. Not just racism, sanctioned racism, government-approved racism, legal racism. Almost none of that history is taught in our schools. With Prairie Lotus, I was trying to both dismantle the single story that exists about that era of history and to show the long-standing record of racism against Asians. I'm sure almost all of you know the famous quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Those words are often attributed to Winston Churchill, or sometimes to the Irish statesman Edmund Burke. But the earliest written record of the quote from 1905 should be credited to Jorge Agustín Nicolás Ruiz de Santayana y Borràs, a Spanish philosopher, better known in English as George Santayana. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. 1871, the Los Angeles Massacre. At least 15 Chinese men lynched. 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first ever anti-immigration law in this country aimed at an entire race of people. 1885, the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming, 28 Chinese men murdered. 1942, Executive Order 9066. President Franklin Roosevelt ordered all Japanese American citizens and residents of Japanese ancestry imprisoned in internment camps. 1982, the murder of Vincent Chin by two white men who beat him to death and never served any jail time. With the possible exception of those internment camps, none of that history was taught to me when I was in school, nor was it taught to my children 3 decades later. Generation after generation, the history of Asian Americans in this country gets erased, forgotten. And so, in 2021, 6 Asian women are murdered in Atlanta. This kind of erasure exists for every marginalized community. For Black Americans, the list is far longer. It's infinitely long. The same is true for the people from indigenous nations. Latin, Muslims, the disabled, gay and trans people, women, all constantly fighting erasure, often literally to the death. Sometimes I feel like inequity and injustice are problems that people don't even want to solve. And I try to use the analogy of cancer. Cancer is a really horrible disease, and it's hard to find someone in this day and age in this country whose life has not been touched by cancer, whose family has not been affected by cancer in one form or another. Back in the day, and even to some extent today, cancer was hushed up. People didn't talk about it. It was something that people felt ashamed of, that felt should be hidden. They didn't talk about it. We cannot solve a problem that we will not acknowledge. If we don't acknowledge it exists, how do we work on it? Well, fortunately, things have changed with cancer. There are now many scientists, researchers, clinicians who are working on the problem of trying to find a cure for cancer. There are families who are fighting it, who are talking about it to get us all better informed. There are people who donate money and time and volunteer their efforts. There are probably millions of people working on fighting cancer. And because of that, there are some cancers that are now considered curable. And I think that the number of those kinds of cancers is going to increase every year. There's hope now for many people who suffer from cancer. We acknowledged the problem, which enabled us to begin working on it. Well, as I said, sometimes I feel like injustice and inequity are problems that people don't even actually want to solve. They don't want to work on them. They don't want to acknowledge that they're a problem. And perhaps it's because they feel somehow their own positions would be threatened. There is evidence to the contrary from every conceivable angle about how allowing injustice and inequity to continue to flourish hurts everyone. Biologically, a varied gene pool is stronger than an inbred one. Societies and cultures throughout history that grant opportunity widely have a better overall standard of living than those that limit opportunity. In places of employment, work groups comprising people of diverse backgrounds are consistently up to 30% more effective and productive than groups of people from similar backgrounds. What exactly are people afraid of, I wonder? Better lives for everyone? On my worst days, I have to remind myself that there is hope. Of course there is. You may have noticed that several times during this talk, I've mentioned the education system. And that is where you all come in. Librarians, teachers, administrators, educators. I think of you as a powerful secret weapon, a weapon that we have to fight against injustice. And what I'd like to do now is offer you 3 ways to use your power. The suggestions that many of you are probably already doing. The first is to adjust or swap out the lens, the perspective through which we view and teach history. History textbooks often lean on single stories. It is up to caring educators to provide a variety of lenses for their students in service of greater truth, to make sure they don't just get one side of the story. Now, I've heard some teachers say, quite rightly, that they're already completely overwhelmed and overworked. And of course, the pandemic has not helped that feeling at all. You know, I can't possibly teach Black history and Asian history and Latinx history and Muslim. I can't do it. I just don't have enough time in the day and days in the year. Of course, I get that. And nobody is expecting or asking teachers to teach everything. Okay, that's very difficult. A school district can certainly implement a more balanced curriculum year by year, but the most important thing is the attitude that you instill in your students. The idea that we're going to be looking at this certain era of history. We don't have time to examine all the different stories involved, but I want you to know that there are many different stories, and perhaps you yourselves will undertake an investigation of the parts of it that really interest you. In other words, the attitude to ask questions, to look at the information you're receiving and to ask questions about where it comes from, how reliable it is, okay, what the source is, what other sources might say. One simple thing I often do when I'm thinking about history and historical fiction, I will read something and the first question that will come to my mind is, who else was there? Who else was there? In this piece of history that I've just learned, there are some very famous men. They're usually men, yes, not just men and, not often men and women, although those perspectives are slowly coming more and more to be unearthed. But it's often the history that's standard in textbooks and other sources. There's a lot of white men. And so I ask myself, who else was there? There are almost always other people there whose perspectives are not represented in the history books and the standard sources. Okay. Who else was there? And now here's an example of what I mean by presenting history from different perspectives and different angles. Here are 4 standard topics that are often in social studies or history textbooks, right? Our eras of American history: the age of discovery and exploration, independence and nation building, westward expansion, manifest destiny, our industrial and digital age. Okay? These are pretty standard topics from when I was being educated and also from when my children were growing up. It's probably, my children are grown now, they're in their 30s. It was probably a little bit better for them, but not all that much. There hadn't been a whole lot of change. Okay. The era of discovery and exploration was also the United States, or what became the United States' first attempt at genocide, at eradicating whole nations and races of people. That's an important truth, an important lens to include in a unit about discovery and exploration. How about independence and nation building? The United States growing from this wayward colony into the most powerful economic nation in the world. How did that happen? It was amazing, it really was. It happened in part because of human trafficking and slavery. Human trafficking that was legal. Slavery that was legal. We do not become the world's greatest economic power without human trafficking and slavery. How about westward expansion, that manifest destiny that the United States was fated by God to reach from sea to shining sea? Well, that was our second attempt at genocide of entire peoples. Today's industrial and digital age, great progress and also tremendous environmental destruction and economic and social apartheid. How are we presenting history to our young students? Are we presenting only a single lens that does not give them greater truth? Now, I'm not saying to leave everything out that's on the left-hand side of this slide, okay? But it is so important that we give our young people the right-hand side as well, to help them explore perspectives, different perspectives in their pursuit of greater truth. Every single one of these things listed on the right-hand side has tremendous implications for their lives today. Toward that end, in addition to centering the story of a biracial Asian girl, Prairie Lotus includes 2 scenes with Indigenous characters, women and girls from the Aceti-Shikowi Nation. On my website, there is a PowerPoint presentation by Andrea Page, an Aceti-Shikowi author and educator, with wonderful information about the history and contemporary life of the nation. Whether or not you use Prairie Lotus with your students, I hope you'll have the chance to share Andrea's presentation with them. Educating our kids on the honest truth of our country's past is the key to its successful future. Whenever we try to cover up something, whether in our personal lives or in our country's history, the result is either not very good or downright disastrous, right? The honest truth is the key to a successful future. We cannot solve a problem if we refuse to acknowledge it. Our best chance for raising kids who will grow up to solve the cancer of injustice and inequity in our society is educating them about its true history and how that history informs our lives today. Okay, so that was tool number 1, switch out the lens. Tool number 2, your shelves. Let's see, what have I got here? Okay. Here is a simple truth. I have never been in a school or public library that didn't have enough white books. How many books would it take for your collection to accurately represent the people who live in this country, let alone the world? I'm not talking about a few books. I'm not talking about a handful of titles each time you order. I'm talking about the need for hundreds of books, at least hundreds. What if every librarian listening to me right now were to dedicate their buying budget for the next 10 years to nothing but books by creators from marginalized backgrounds? Every single penny. Think about that. You and I know very well that this is not going to happen. Of course, you'll still be buying books by white creators. But if you set that as a goal for your shelves to demonstrate realistic and truthful representation, what a fantastic service that would be for your students and patrons. To show them via your shelves what our world is really like. all of your students would be served by this, including and especially if your community is mostly white. Many of us are by now familiar with Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop's metaphor of books as mirrors and windows. Mirrors to reflect the student's own experience or the reader's own experience, windows to show them less familiar visions. When cited, that metaphor often leaves out the third element she wrote about, the sliding glass doors. Books that don't just show readers a different world, but invite them to step into it, creating empathy, creating connection to those characters who on the surface seem different. To become caring citizens of the world, all of us need sliding glass doors, but no one needs them more than those from the dominant culture. If our young readers are going to grow up to help solve the problems in our communities, in the nation, in the world, they need the tools provided by sliding glass door books. Any library that does not have lots of books on its shelves is a library, lots of books like that on its shelves, is a library that is not best serving its community. Okay, so your lenses and your shelves, and finally your book talks. For those of you who do book talks to K-12 students, you are already well aware of how quickly most young readers form an impression of a book. That cover, so important, right? When you're introducing books to a group of kids, the object is hopefully to interest as many of them as possible. So I want to give you an example now of two different book talks for introducing my book, A Single Shard. Here's an example of book talk number 1 by an incredibly enthusiastic librarian who loves this book. I'm going to tell you about this book, which is one of my personal favorites. It takes place in Korea, in Asia, all the way on the other side of the world. And it takes place almost 1,000 years ago, when the way people lived was completely different from the way we live today. It is fascinating. You're going to love learning about life in such a different time and place. I've heard variations of that book talk countless times, and the enthusiasm is unmistakable, right? Okay, now here's book talk number 2. Did you ever want something really, really badly? So badly that you thought you would do almost anything to get it? That is what this book is about. This is about a kid who wants something with all his heart, and what he sets out to do to get it. Does he get what he wants in the end? You'll have to read the book to find out. The first approach, however well-intentioned, is what I call othering. It's creating distance between the reader and the book. Far away, long ago, so different. The second approach is an example of what I call centering. It's putting the story and the kid in the same circle, letting young readers know what they have in common with the main character. Now remember, I'm talking about making that crucial first impression to a group of kids. Of course, you can go on to give more setting details. Maybe you know a particular student who loves historical fiction, who loves stories set in other countries, but as a first impression, center that book within the frame of your students' own experiences. Because no matter who we are, adults or young people, no matter what kind of books we love, every reader asks the same question every time they open a book, without exception. And that question is, what's in it for me? What's in this book for me? By centering the book, you're showing students how they can begin to answer that question for themselves. So in conclusion, please buy multiple copies of both of these books for your collections. Not kidding. And here's a slide that sums up the action items I spoke about just now. 1, use multiple lenses. 2, curate your shelves. 3, center the book and the reader. Powerful ways to begin changing the world. You see why I think of you all as a secret weapon? I know that all of you surely have days when you feel that your work is unappreciated, undervalued, even embattled. I hope you'll take a moment on those days to consider the importance of the work you do. Plain and simple, what librarians do every day, what you do every day, is to preserve and share the world's wisdom. And those of you who work with young people, by doing that, you are helping prepare the next generation to save the world. It's not exaggeration. In my book, that makes you all superheroes. And the rest of us are so fortunate that you have chosen to live and work among us for at least a little while. I will never be able to thank you enough for the work you have chosen to do. Thank you very much.